Okay, now let me, I actually would like to spend as much time as I can on Durkheim's methodology. I have lots of notes. This is the 24th lecture note this semester for this course. But let me rush through of the test questions and just to tell you how I would like to deal with them. I think the first one is, very obvious, probably a bit too obvious. The question is, how can you make it interesting? I hope that the distinction between power and domination is clear, right? Power means that somebody can impose its will on somebody else, even if that other person opposes it. There is a strong element of coercion involved, right? You can coerce people to obey your command. Domination implies that you do not have to use coercion systematically because people tend to internalize the reasons those who have power use in order to legitimate why they should have power, right? And then this brings us to the notion of legitimacy, right? Legitimacy are the claims which are made by those who have power, which try to justify why it is reasonable that they should issue commands and others should obey it. So far, very simple, right? What is kind of controversial about this? It's controversial the way how Weber uses the notion of legitimacy. Normally, we, in modern democratic theory, we believe, right, the system is legitimate when it has a popular consent. We think about universal suffrage. People go to free and fair elections, and then they elect leaders, and then they follow those, those elected to office this way. Then power is legitimate. But I think Weber wants to have a broader notion of legitimacy because free and fair elections operating with universal suffrage go back 100 years in human history, and in some countries it still does not exist. And Weber does not want to describe the last 10 minutes of human history, for human history is 24 hours, right? He wants to offer some conceptual tools to understand the whole 24 hours. So that's why he has this interesting notion of legitimacy, which it does imply that people have to have a certain degree of belief in the validity of the legitimacy claims. But it is a rather passive notion of belief. They don't have to love the person in position of authority. They do not have to elect it. They simply, it's enough if they think, well, I cannot think of a better alternative, right? Another dictator could be worse than this one, right? This is a dictator, but a reasonable one. And Weber will say, as long as this is happening, the person in authority will not have to use coercion systematically, and therefore it will be legitimate, right? Let me also just say that, of course, the coercive element is also in domination, right? If people disobey the law, then they will be coerced. There is certainly a promise of coercion even in modern free democracies. People are put in jail. In this country, people are even executed. Right? So there is an element of coercion. Just the real question is how systematic that coercion should be. And for Weber, pure exercise of authority is relatively rare and marginal. I would say, for instance, the sort of last year or 2 or 3 of Hitler was clearly illegitimate. Hitler had to use massive coercion. Certain epochs of rule of Stalin in the Soviet Union were illegitimate, not all the rule of Stalin. During the Second World War, he established some legitimacy. But when he had to imprison 10 million people, right, and to kill tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, that is an indication that this is illegitimate. Okay? So that's the way how I would handle it, right? To work around this interesting conception of legitimacy and what is for and against this. Well, this is again a very simple question, traditional and legal rational authority, right? The basic differences, right? The traditional authority, you have a personal master. In legal rational authority, you do not have a personal master. You obey the laws, and the people who are in charge, who are superiors, will also have to obey the same laws, what you are required to do. And traditional authority is legitimated by the sanctity of age-old rules. Here again, I think the interesting issue, if I would write about this, will be, well, this is a big, historical distinction. But Weber also uses it to describe, in contemporary society, different type of organizations. So, contemporary theory has a big dose of traditional authority in it, right? And I will try to elaborate on this. Well, this is, right, one of the trickier questions. Why does Weber believe that bureaucracy is efficient? And you may agree or may disagree with him. So first of all, I would state why Weber believes that bureaucracy is efficient. I would emphasize that he thinks that bureaucracy is the most efficient in the technical terms, not necessarily otherwise. And then, of course, the way how he defines bureaucracy, people are put into position in terms of their competence. There is a rule of law. It is a predictable environment, a bureaucratic environment. There is a hierarchy of appeals. If somebody makes a mistake, you know how to appeal. This, of course, all makes it efficient. Now, we know that bureaucracies are often inefficient. So how to reconcile this? Now, that's not that Weber was totally insensitive to the problem of inefficiencies of bureaucracies. And he formulated it how that bureaucracies are caught between formal and substantive rationality. That's the way how I would probably defend Weber, to say he was not that naive to believe that bureaucracies are always efficient. They would be efficient if they would be purely formally rational, but they are not. And one good example is welfare bureaucracies, which do establish a kind of patron-client relationships, right, between bureaucracies and clients. Some people refer to this as welfare dependency, which makes it, of course, a cause of inefficiency. Well, this is a nice question to answer. We discussed this a great deal. We know that charismatic leaders appear in times of crisis, when people are looking for a change, right? So Barack Obama, during the presidential campaign, he has read Weber carefully. He knew how to frame, right, his message exactly as a charismatic message. It was all about change, and it was about hope, right? In contrast with Hillary Clinton or John McCain, both of them emphasized that we are experienced. This is not what people wanted to hear when they wanted to have change. So yes, in this respect, Barack Obama did have a charismatic appeal, and this charismatic appeal did gel, right? Many people responded to his charisma. He was criticized by his opponent, that he's a rock star, right? Because people got so excited about him. So he could appeal to the emotion of people, right? He could appeal to them. But of course, as we again discussed in discussion sections, also briefly in class, Barack Obama has a charismatic appeal, but he operates in a legal rational authority, right? And we just have seen that very recently, right? Making a decision about the war in Afghanistan, right? Well, he had to deal with realities, right? So, well, Weber would in the classical sense, charisma in Weber is reserved to great religious leaders, such as Muhammad or Jesus or whatever, or the great prophets. And in this sense, charisma is not really applicable to politicians operating in legal rational authority. So Weber would have some unease to call Barack Obama a charismatic leader. I would think he would concede that certainly Barack Obama had charismatic features as such. Now the fifth question, Durkheim and the study of law. Why on earth he starts from the study of law in analyzing society? Because he is a methodological collectivist and because he wants to capture something like the collective conscience, which is more than the sum total of individual consciousness. But he's also a scientist, and I hope I will have a little time to talk about the methodology. He wants to be very rigorous, and he doesn't want to start with ideas. He wants to start with facts. Well, he is caught in a contradiction. So collective conscience is ideas. How on earth you study them objectively? Law is a great example, because law is written down, right? There is written law. You can study it objectively, and it is not on individual consciousness, but guides us all. So I think this is the major reason why his point of departure is, as an example, law, because this is what he can rigorously study, can be seen as a social fact, right? That this is the law, and to understand why this law came into being, under what circumstances, and how does it influence people. Well, of course, the inspiration comes from Montesquieu. All right. Agreement and disagreement. I think the real question is whether you buy into methodological collectivism or not. Some of you may be methodological individualist, especially if you are an econ major. You tend to be an economic individualist, a methodological individualist, right? You tend to believe that there are rational individual actors who pursue interest. You are very skeptical about anything which is assumedly above the individual. So in that case, if you are a methodological individualist, and in fact, I think the dominant trend in social sciences today is methodological individualism and a great deal of skepticism about methodological collectivism. That can be a kind of critical handle on it, or at least you can show this is the way how it can be criticized, and you can show why you actually think that methodological collectivism is reasonable. Okay, the sixth question, organic and mechanical solidarity and how this is related to Weber's typology for authority. I mean, it's pretty simple. There are very, very important differences between Durkheim and Weber. Durkheim looks at what brings society together. The central concept is solidarity. Weber looks at social conflict, what takes society apart. So he looks at struggle around power, right? Weber is coming from the lineage of, I would say, Hobbes and Nietzsche, right? That's where the Weberian view comes from. There are, of course, similarities. organic solidarity is what legal rational authority is for Weber. They try to capture modernity. Both are similar in the sense that they are also social typologies of societies, but also types of social organizations in any given society as such. So these are some similarities. Okay, I think that's probably about it. Well, the question of anomie, I think we covered this recently, so I don't have to refresh your memory as much. The notion of anomie in Durkheim comes out of the absence of sufficient regulation. And this is a temporary product which emerges because mechanical solidarity is breaking down and organic solidarity has not been established yet. And in the transition from mechanical solidarity, traditional society, into a modern urban industrial society, people have a problem of regulation and value systems, and that's when they are anomic. But this will go away. What is the theory of human nature behind this? This can be debated. One possible argument is that since he believes that, order has to come from the outside, from above, he tends to believe that without order created by a societal level, collective conscience, we would do evil things. We need to be regulated, right? Well, of course, he knows that we can be over-regulated, and then that's also pathological. But the main pathology, at least in the transition from mechanical to organic solidarity, is the absence of regulation and the problem that humans may do abnormal, pathological, or evil acts. So that is a notion of humans needing control over them. Now, this is speaks to the 8th question, anomie and alienation. They are in many ways the opposite to each other, right? Alienation means that you are over-regulated. You are not in control of your own life, of your own fate. That is what alienation means. Also, Marx is inspired by Rousseau. It's a kind of Rousseauian conception of nature behind that. The problem comes from society, it doesn't come from the individual, right? We are born in society, we are social by nature, and if modern capitalism would be removed, we again would act socially and collectively in a good way. So that's, and in contrast, like Durkheim's notion is the absence of regulation. That's what causes pathologies. All right, 9th question. This is something what I think you find difficulties to deal with because you did not find the word disenchantment in any of the readings. And indeed, Weber did not use the word very often. He did use it most critically in an essay what he wrote after he was trying to combine his various sociology of religions. But the word enchantment is translated from the German word magic. So disenchantment means a situation in which the world loses magic, when magic is moved out of life. And this is happening with rationalization, right? The big process of historical evolution is towards rationalization and the loss of magic. And the text what you have to support that is in the Protestant Ethic, where Weber makes a big deal out of it. That what especially Calvinism and the teaching of predestination did, it got rid of magic, right? But Though he is, say, a rationalist, he sees the downside of rationalism. The loss of magic is the price what we have to pay for rationalization. And he's a bit nostalgic about the world when it was magic, when the relations were magical. That is a kind of a permanent conditions of modernity. Things are not getting any better. That's, I think, one of the big differences with Durkheim's notion of anomie. The loss of magic actually does mean, there is a Marx, roots in Marx here, because the loss of magic means that actually you seem to be more vulnerable to fate, right? Magic, you were a magician, you had ways how to make God, the omnipotent God, to do things for you, for instance, to save you, right? You could do it through magical means. In a rationalized world, we are less in control of our lives. So in this sense, I think Weber's notion of disenchantment is closer to the Marxian notion of alienation rather than the Durkheimian notion of anomie. Well, social causes of suicide. Well, we just covered this last lecture. The argument is, right, that we believe that suicide is the most individual, intimate decision. He actually does show and demonstrate this is not the case because there are great differences in suicide rate across countries. These differences tend to be very stable. There are also strong relationships between suicide and religion, and suicide and education. And therefore there are, right, social determinants of this very individualistic action as suicide. Now there are these two dimensions in which you can conceptualize suicide, how well integrated you are, or how well regulated you are. And Durkheim has this idea that too much integration and too much regulation, or too little integration or too little regulation, are both abnormal. He is for the golden middle road, right? Normality is in the middle road. Sort of an anomic suicide happens when you are not sufficiently regulated. Egoistic suicide occurs when you are not sufficiently integrated in society. That's when you act egoistically, commit suicide, because you don't care how killing yourself will affect your beloved ones, right? Because you don't have beloved ones, right? You are not integrated in society, right? You do not commit egoistic suicide when you care about the beloved ones and you don't want to cause them pain by killing yourself, right? Anomic suicide happens if people are kind of not sufficiently regulated, and therefore they, in this anomic situation, may commit suicide. Okay, so that's about it. And let me then move on to Durkheim's methodology. Okay. Yeah, number 24. So this is the Rules of Sociological Method, published in 1895, 2 years after the division of labor and 2 years before the suicide, but foreshadows and combines elements from both. I have a lot of stuff, so I will rush you through. One question is what he deals with when is a fact social? When can we talk about social facts? Then he asks, how can we observe social facts? Then he makes a distinction between normal and pathological states. He also writes about nominalism and realism and offers an alternative to nominalism and realism. What is his system of classifications? And then he addresses the issue of the question of explanation and causality, very path-breaking ideas in his times. So when is a fact social? And the first point is, well, we have to make a distinction between social and biological or psychological phenomena. And then he also, I will elaborate on this. And then he asks the question, how objective are the social facts? The biological facts are obviously objective, psychological, not so obviously, the social, the least so. Why are they still objective? And then he labors on what makes the social facts collective as such. And that is, of course, education is the major mechanism. Okay, so let's ask the question, what is the social fact as distinct from biological or psychological? Well, he said, well, if all facts which affect human beings would be regarded as social, there would be no real discipline, what he should be called sociology. And as I pointed out before, right, he's the first person who identifies emphatically with the discipline of sociology. He actually has this notion of life sciences, interestingly, right? And sociology is part of life sciences, right? There are three life sciences: sociology, biology, and psychology. But these three different life sciences deal with different units of analysis, deal with different objects. All right? Biology deals with the body. Psychology deals with a personality. While sociology deals, this is his shtick, right? It deals with collective representations. Right? He tries to move beyond the idea of collective consciousness, collective representation, which somehow objectively embodies as a fact the states of collective consciousness. And therefore, he said, this is indeed a set of phenomena I will be able to distinguish with other facts. So when do I act socially? He has a question. I do so when I execute my contract, right? I perform duties, right, which are defined externally to me, right? If I perform my duties, then I am acting socially. I'm a socially responsible person. That seems to be right, straightforward and obvious. Okay, how objective they are. At first look, it doesn't look too objective because the sense of obligation seems to be very subjective, right? You may occasionally say to your partner, you are irresponsible, right? By which you mean, you don't have enough of a feeling of a duty towards me, right? So there is this subjective element involved in this. But he said, nevertheless, we can see this is still objective. And one of the major way how we can understand it is objective, that in fact there is some external enforcement, right, of these obligations. If you keep breaking these obligations, there will be penalties against you, right? Well, not all the time. Occasionally you can get away with it, but at one point there may be punishment. You see others being punished by not fulfilling their duties or obligations, and therefore you can see that that is externally enforced. It's not just subjective thing that you think you have duties, right? It will be externally implemented. So, well, you have obligations, right? At 7 p.m. today to go on the internet and unload questions, right? And to answer 2 of them. This, of course, will come as subjective feelings of duty in you. It's have enough guilt feelings if you don't do it in a timely manner, if you would be late. It's sufficiently internalized in you. But you know that there were occasions when people were late with an assignments, and there were teaching fellows or professors who deducted, right, something from the grade. So therefore you don't want to risk a lower grade, and beyond your deep personal commitment that I want to fulfill my duty in a timely manner, right? There is also a concern that if I don't, I may get some penalty, right? So that's what it makes it social, right? Okay, well, it has to be collective, right? It cannot be just individual. We have a collective sense of obligations, and he uses the term habits. It's a very good term, which I don't think has been used before him so forcefully as Durkheim did. It became very widely used more recently, following another great French sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu, who turned this term habit into a term habitus, right? Well, habit, habitus, mores, manners, ways of life, right, means that we have something, we know how to navigate in social life, right? We know how to deal with situations. These are habits, the ways how we behave in social life. And he said, where does it come from? He said, this is coming from education, right? It's, you are being educated, you know what you are supposed to do. That's not exactly, right, what Hobbes meant. Hobbes had this idea, right, of manners and customs, but he believed that these manners and customs simply he could explain from the individual actors, right? The individuals act, and then they know that there will be an alter who will respond. They evaluate what the possible answer of the alter will be, and therefore they will learn ways how to navigate anticipating possible punishment from alters, right? So Hobbes can do it by doing a methodological individualist exercise. Durkheim exercises, no. I mean, this is not how we learn it, through acting and getting punishment and seeing others being punished. It is through the system of education. Now, this is a good point, an interesting point. And here again, right, this is kind of crystallized in ways of acting. That's what habit, or in the more contemporary version, habitus, is all about, right? I think Bourdieu also means that habitus is something what you learn and carry in yourself, and depending what your habits or habitus are, will mean how you will fit in different situations. We occasionally think that people get into positions where they don't have the appropriate habitus to behave, right? And therefore they may not be performing a task very well because they do not have the proper habits. The habits are kind of internalized earlier in life, and then it helps us to perform different functions in society. Well, I have to rush. So how do we observe social facts? And now here comes, these social facts are things. And what we need is a rigorous discipline, right, for social analysis. And that also implies that we have to get rid of all of our preconceptions. We have to define the objects of our investigations independently from our values. It's almost a value-free science, what he argues. I will say not quite. And we have to get rid of those data which are too subjective. Sort of. Social facts are things, objects. Well, this is a very interesting citation, what you would not expect from Durkheim to come, and reads almost like Karl Marx in the German ideology, right? The proper science should not proceed from ideas to things, but from things to ideas, right? It's almost identical to the German ideology. But he, of course, means something different, right? The things are not property relations, right? The things are actually collective manifestations, right? Collective ideas. So the notion of thing is used here in a very unique and very different way. But what he emphasizes, right, that they are not the individual ideas, but they are kind of crystallized, and it's out there over us, like things, what we cannot change. Individuals cannot really change. And he said, well, social sciences evolve just like natural sciences by getting rid of prejudices, right? Dogmas, moving beyond dogmas and substitute them with the study of facts. That's what Bacon, the philosopher, right, in 17th century suggested. All scientific investigation should start from induction, from the observance of sensually observable facts. So he invokes Bacon, right, that this is the scientific method, right? Well, it is not necessarily sensuousness which is emphasized in Durkheim, but moving beyond preconceptions and dogmas. And he said, well, the theory should be only introduced when science is sufficiently at an advanced stage. Well, this is a very good advice to people who are graduate students and are doing dissertations. Don't start with theory, right? Start by analyzing social facts, and when you are sufficiently advanced, that's when you find the proper theory. When you will be doing your senior thesis, I think it's a good advice to take, right? Don't start with big words. Start with actual analysis and find theory when you already have a scientific idea. And here he comes, a strong critique of economists of his time, a critique what some people will say would apply to economists today. He said economists today principally are occupied how the economy ought to work rather than to understanding how the economy actually works, right? Paul Krugman just published a little piece in New York Times a couple of weeks ago. He actually accused his own colleagues. He said, you created this mess, you know, with the financial markets because you were never looking at how the economy really works. You operated how the economy should be working, but we really should be studying how the economy works. So it's an interesting criticism of economics, what I mean, not necessarily true for all economists, and it can be debated whether a normative science which describes how something should operate is illegitimate. But he certainly takes the idea that it should not be normative. Well, we have to get rid of preconceptions, right? And he said Descartes and Bacon disagreed with each other, right? As I said, Bacon was the one who said the analysis should start from induction, observing phenomena what we can sensuously study, and then move towards theorizing later on. Descartes was opting for a deductive method. He said, well, we have to start from general abstractions and then to move to derived hypothesis from this general and then to move to the facts. This is the difference between Bacon and Descartes. But he said, but they do agree in one thing, namely that no matter whether your reasoning is inductive, right, from observation to theory, or deductive, from theory to observation, they agree that we should get rid of the dogmas, no preconceptions. And he said this is particularly difficult in social sciences because we think we know how society works. We don't necessarily think we need social scientists to tell us how society works. We experience society and therefore we have an idea how it works. And we have strong interest how we would want society to work. And if the conception, if the findings goes against our interest or beliefs, strong sentiments, we tend to disregard it. So it's very difficult to get rid of dogmas in social sciences because we have an ordinary knowledge, right? Not scientific, but ordinary knowledge how society and the economy operates, right? And we have an interest as well involved. So very difficult to get rid of our preconceptions. Well, he said, well, yes, because we have very strong sentiments. And that's okay. We should study the sentiments. The sentiments should study as if they were objects. But we should not be led by sentiments, right? We have to proceed without passion and without prejudices. Well, we have to define the objects of our investigation independently from our values as such. And therefore, he said, we have to come up with objective definitions of what we are studying. He said, what is a crime? He said, crime is a social act which are punished. Therefore, I don't have to make a value judgment in defining crime. If I see a society in which certain acts are systematically punished by that society, I can say, in this society, this is defined as a crime. I may disagree with this. I may say this should not be a crime, but in this society, it is a crime. In many societies, for instance, homosexual acts were defined as a crime. In those societies, they were a crime. You can disagree with it, and you should say, well, homosexuality should be decriminalized, as it was, fortunately, decriminalized. It's not a crime any longer. Well, smoking and selling marijuana is a crime, right? It is being punished. You can end up in jail. That's a fact. You may think that marijuana should be decriminalized, but the fact that the consumption of marijuana and marketing of marijuana is a crime today in the United States is an objective fact, right? And it can be studied by looking at the law and what on earth judges do in this country, right? So that's his point. It doesn't matter what your values are, what matters what the practices of society are. The same goes for morality. He said, well, some people will say, well, they are immoral because they act differently than I do. He said, no. Every society has morality. You have to understand what their morality is, even if it is different from your own morality. Well, we have to disregard two subjective informations. This is what scientists do when they use measures and instruments. That's what, he's very much attracted to the scientific reasoning in sociology. It's a very French idea. And then he makes a distinction between normal and pathological. So what is the difference between normal and pathological? Well, he said normal is the most frequent form of action, right? We need a conception for normality because we just cannot operate without defining abnormality. But how can we do that and at the same time remain objective when we can say something is abnormal without us being? He said it's easy, because what we shall do, that we should regard those as normal, which is sort of the most common way of act, and to define the extremes as abnormal. And he said the reason for this is that it would be incomprehensible if the most widespread act would not at the same time the most advantageous one. But then he takes it back. He said, well, we can actually see a number of occasions when frequently behavior which is frequently followed is actually not useful. In this case, it may be inherited from the past. It may have been functional at one point of time. The situation changed and people still keep their habit. And they still keep behaving that way. And that can be now defined as abnormal, though it can be probably quite average behavior, right? Think of racism, for instance, is a good example, right? Well, that is a very interesting argument about crime. He said, well, a crime looks like it is indeed by definition pathological, but is it? He said, well, crime is present in all societies. When is, he makes this very interesting argument, and therefore really I think we are calling crime abnormal if there are too much crime in society. Crime per se is a normal state as such. Well, I think I leave this nominalism, realism argument out. We'll put it on the internet. About causality, I finish with the idea of causality. He said, well, the task of social sciences is to explain, not only to describe, to be able to deal with causes and causality. And there are different methods how to do causality. He said, in social sciences, the typical method is comparative, rather than experimental. In natural sciences, we do experiments. In social sciences, we can't. Experiment does assume that we assign certain stimuli randomly to a population and then to see how they respond to this stimulus. We can't do that in society. And as I mentioned about suicide, we cannot assign people to get married and others to assign not to get married and to study later on what the effect of marriage was on something like suicide. So therefore what we can do is the comparative method. Well, I think I'm out of time. He makes a distinction between two types of comparative methods. The comparative methods can be either the method of agreement. A method of agreement if I compare two similar type of societies, for instance, the United States and Canada, and to see whether there is difference between these two countries. For instance, the level, I have a theory that poverty may be related to crime. People in, who are hungry are more likely to steal food, right? Because they have to feed themselves, to put it very simply. Now I compare two societies by the level of poverty is the same, and then I will see whether it is indeed poorer people are more likely to commit certain type of crimes. Or I can do the method of difference, and the method of difference if I compare two very different countries. I compare the United States with Bangladesh, where there is a very different rate of crime, right? And then I see whether there is a difference in crime as such. He said the problem with this method is that there is not enough cases, and therefore the proper method, interestingly argues, is correlation. What we have to do is to find what the correlation are between two variables. Well, this was guiding contemporary social sciences, but Durkheim was smarter than most number crunchers in social sciences, because here I think the last sentence, what I show you, is important. Well, you have to make sure that the relationship, what the causal relationship shows, is really causal, right? And therefore, we shall investigate by the aid of deduction how one of the two terms has produced the other one, right? Today, we would say what Durkheim is suggesting, if you want to establish real causality, short of the possibility of an experimental method, you have to figure out what is the causal mechanism, what relates the two phenomena together, which are statistically correlated to each other. Statistical correlation does not necessarily show that they are, one is causing the other one, right? You have a theory that the storch brings the baby, and then you test this, and you show that, fertility in Scandinavia is low, and there are not many storches. So you have a very strong correlation between number of storches and number of babies being born. This still does not show that, right, the storches bring the babies, right? Therefore, you have to look at the causal mechanism, how babies are being produced. That's basically, I think, a very early, insightful argument by Durkheim's methodology. And that's about it. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Thanks.